this edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. We're recording here on the afternoon of Friday, January 12th, 2018. And you're going to hear this starting on Saturday, January 13th, 2018. And we're already working our way through the 2018 calendar. Those congressional elections in November should be coming up, barring unforeseen meddling. Yesterday, or Thursday of this week, Alexander Hamilton's birthday. A good time to remind ourselves about the inherent superiority of the American system of economics. And, of course, we're going into Martin Luther King Day this coming Monday. Now, why don't we pause for a second before we go into the dreary catalog of the latest scatological outbursts from the dotard of Pennsylvania Avenue. Let's think about what it was like when great men walked the earth. Now, Martin Luther King, his day celebrated here on Monday, along with other presidents. Right? That's also part of it. But presidents. That's coming up in a little while. So Martin Luther King. What is the special relevance of Martin Luther King to us right now? It is, I would say, that he had this political, sociological imagination to see that an effective protest, but also an effective challenge, a challenge with the capacity of seizing some power, seizing part of power, seizing as much as you can under this admittedly fragmented system, was a matter of seeing the various movements, the protests of the 1960s, had to be seen as ontologically one movement, one, united, not fragmented, not parochial, not existing in separate lanes or separate tracks, but ontologically, metaphysically united in the sense that none of them, not one of them, could succeed without the success of the other. They were all indispensable. The ones I'm talking about, of course, are the civil rights movement, which was emphatically black and white. You can look at the people who helped to finance this, helped to organize it. Look at the founding and the running of the NAACP and the Urban League and so forth. So civil rights was one, and that was already multiracial, super racial, you might say. Civil rights was one. Then came labor. King was killed, of course, in Memphis. What was he doing in Memphis in the spring of 1968? We're coming up now on the 50th anniversary of this tragic event. He was there to take part in a labor struggle. Wait a minute, we might say today. What kind of intersectionality is that? Here you are, a civil rights leader, and you're out there fighting for workers. I mean, admittedly, a lot of these were black workers. They were the black garbage men, the sanitation men of Memphis. But there he was, and that's how he fell, right? He fell, killed in action on the front of labor. So he wanted to bring in as much of labor, organized labor and all labor, unemployed, as he possibly could. You notice that this was supplemented by the Poor People's Campaign, right? By this, I remember seeing it. There I was at Michigan and Balbo during the Democratic Convention, during the police riot. There we were at Michigan and Balbo, and along comes Reverend Ralph Abernathy, the successor of Martin Luther King, and they had this wagon train, this mule train that was precisely in that intersection at the height of the police riot, right, when they were gassing everybody and clubbing everybody. So labor, but not just labor in the sense of, the craft unions or the aristocracy of labor. No. It was employed workers reaching out to help organize, to help other unorganized workers as well as unemployed workers. So employed and organized, unionized, employed that needed to be unionized, and then, of course, the unemployed who needed jobs and a union to get anywhere. So that was the second bucket, as we might say, in today's climate. And then, of course, the third was the anti-war movement, including the student movement. Right? It would be SDS, as long as this had not become a madhouse. The people that were organizing the various moratoria demonstrations, right? The mobilization against the war in Vietnam, right? The Fifth Avenue Peace Parade Committee, all kinds of different groups. And, of course, King had gone out of his way to make some very eloquent speeches. I think one of his greatest lines is that the hopes of the civil rights movement had somehow gotten shipwrecked off the coast of Vietnam. He saw what a tragic, waste, crime this was, and was determined to put an end to it. So King's basic argument was civil rights plus labor, poor people, plus anti-war student movement and related. All of that had to be brought together. And this, I would say, the forces, these dark forces, in particular in the framework of the J. Edgar Hoover, FBI, this was the unforgivable sin, because this is the most basic idea of how to organize, right? If you want to get anywhere, you can't have this fragmentation. King was not a practitioner of identity politics. No way. He was not interested in specific quotas. He was interested in a massive augmentation, an increase in the level of jobs and prosperity. And that, of course, would then be something that all groups would participate in. So that, I think, is the genius of Martin Luther King. Now, you just look around you, and you will see how far away the relatively less qualified successors of King in all fields, right? Not just his organization, but all over the place, how far we are from that today, right? Today, you get emails about what the left has to do, and it talks in there about bringing together the various movements and the various identities and somehow promoting intersectionality, and as if the normal, natural condition of these movements were to be separate. In other words, they're going to be ontologically separate till the end of time. There's going to be women over here and Hispanics over here and the black movement over here, and then you're going to have certain other movements, LGBTQ. That's all going to be separate. This makes no sense. This is an invitation to the wreckers. And we also have to say, where did this fragmentation come from? The biggest danger when you're dealing with mass strike situations is the idea of divide and conquer. This is the gospel of the ruling class, really of every ruling class. And instead, it was under Richard Nixon, and in particular George Shultz, as Secretary of Labor, that we got this fragmentation known then as the Philadelphia Plan. And so hats off to Martin Luther King. He knew that unity was primary, and anything else was. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So we're marking the Martin Luther King holiday, seeking to honor the actual content of what this great national leader provided. He seemed to be the main one who could see what should be obvious, but of course so seldom is, that unity is primary and fragmentation is not to be promoted or cultivated or fetishized. Leave that to the ruling class. They'll figure out ways to split and divide and wreck. But his job was to unite. So again, civil rights, labor, unemployed, poor people, and anti-war students and other groups. Now there was a nascent women's movement there too, which I'm sure he would have included at a later point, because that's exactly the point. You've got to include all of them, and what you're going to need to do that is a programmatic platform that expresses the needs and interests of all, and everybody's got to be willing to fight for the entire coalition. This is in many ways the Franklin D. Roosevelt National Coalition of the 1930s, upgraded 30 years later by King. And the efficacy of this was quite clearly the Robert Kennedy presidential campaign was essentially an attempt to win the presidency and take power based on precisely this idea. Right? Some writers, I guess Jack Newfield of the Village Voice, who had become an activist in the Robert Kennedy for President campaign during 1968, wrote very, very relevant things about Robert Kennedy's ability to bring together white workers in these places like Gary, Indiana, Hammond, Indiana, cities that had been more or less on the verge of race war quite recently, partly as a result of the Martin Luther King assassination. Robert Kennedy was able to bring together black leaders, but not even leaders to be sure, but also sports figures, organic community figures from white workers and black citizens and the black community, and bring them together. There's one where he goes around, I guess it's Gary, Indiana, in a convertible, where he's sitting there between a black representative and a white worker representative, and that's a powerful front. This is exactly what Trump is designed to block. To make this, the very idea of this is purely heretical. So this is also why the forces, right, these dark forces that we know, right, in those days, very strongly implanted in the J. Edgar Hoover FBI, because he was still on the job, right? Remember, he stayed around until 1972, I think it was, right? And then who got his files? This is I think the thing that makes sense to remember out of Martin Luther King. So if you go to these celebrations and ceremonies, which of course is a good thing to do, see whether this point is properly understood. Because now we have the identity groups and the ideas that they're all metaphysically independent. None of them really has anything to do with any other. And they're going to be separate. So the fundamental unity of U.S. history, the fundamental unity of world history also, is lost. It's like Oswald Spengler, right? Oswald Spengler said each culture is a hermetically sealed entity that interacts to some degree with the others but never mix. Well, they do mix, and that's the melting pot, right? That is absolutely the melting pot, as I guess it was the papal nuncio had to come and remind us at the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception on Christmas Eve, right? That the melting pot is closely related to the Pope's concept of the culture of encounter and dialogue. All right, so we'd like to tarry more in the past with Martin Luther King, but unfortunately the press of horrible events that fill us with consternation and disgust and revulsion compel our attention. And of course, this is now the dotard of Pennsylvania Avenue, his endless turbulence, his endless machinations, his endless quest for attention. So where do we stand? Well, let's just try to reconstruct the last couple of weeks. We had, of course, the Michael Wolff book. And the leading point, I guess, that public opinion has gotten out of that book, although there are other points in there, and it's valuable, it's a godsend, but it's not exactly a universal compendium of everything about Trump. It focuses on the unfitness for office, the mental incapacity, the inability to assimilate information, to learn things, right, to master a briefing book and to make rational decisions. So the idea is that this book is certainly a powerful case for activating the 25th Amendment. However, we also have to look at the sides of the book that are not as strong. And again, I'm not a Karpin critic. I think the Karpin critics are crazy. The cult of access by certain leading journalists, right, be it from the New York Times or elsewhere, right, they're so worried about their journalistic ethics and their formalities that they become pedants. No, this is not the point. But when we get to Russiagate, well, here we find then Wolff brings in Edward J. Epstein, wrote his first book on the Kennedy assassination in 1966, and I'm afraid he has been, not contributing to clarity on most of this stuff, right? Obfuscating quite a few things along the way, and it turned out, of course, that he was closely linked to James Jesus Angleton of the CIA, and I guess his most recent book is a biography of James Jesus Angleton, counterintelligence director of the CIA, writing about the moles. Right? Well, we know there were moles now. We know there was Robert Hansen, and we know about that was the FBI mole, and then we had Aldrich Ames in the CIA, and those are the moles, right? So there were moles. He was right, but unfortunately, a discussion of Russiagate that relies on Angleton will not cut this. That's no good, and therefore that's a weakness of. We'll be World Crisis Radio. Here we are in Washington D.C. in the middle of a January thaw. It's a January thaw with a vengeance, and we're here to remind you once again: everything is moving very fast. It's a dizzying kaleidoscope of events, but we can help you to make sense of it. We can identify the red threads that go through it and how to make sense of it, and above all, how to master it by acting on it. That's the best way, right? You engage, and then you find out. So that's our method, and that's the World Crisis Radio here starting on Saturday every week, but also The American System. The American System, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of each week, 1 hour plus of up-to-date commentary and explanations, marching orders, what to do, and other, I think, valuable material, indispensable material. So for that, you go to www.americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv. You go there, a token fee, and you're in business. And you can, we'll be referring to some of our broadcasts from this past week during the course of this program. All right. So the Michael Wolff book has dominated the thinking of the Trump administration because it seems to have put a tremendous scare into them. I put the fear of God into this gang. And the idea is, you're not fit for the presidency. You're crazy. You're unstable. And we've got questions like the New York Times editorial, is he nuts? We've got other commentators saying that not this past week, but the previous week was this week too, largely dominated by an attempt to fend off the accusation of dementia. So that then led on, the previous week was all wrapped up with Michael Cohen. The other contributing factor, of course, the previous week had been the bigger button speech, right? And essentially a blood-curdling thermonuclear threat to North Korea delivered in this nonchalant, cavalier, devil-may-care method, right? So he's playing games with your life. He's puffing up his own idiotic ego based on putting your life in danger. Surely nobody wants this to continue. Any sensible person says that has to end, and it doesn't look like reform is possible. So separation, removal becomes the imperative. Now this week, on Tuesday, we had, in continuation of this maneuver, a Potemkin meeting. The Potemkin meeting, of course, this is the facade, right? Listen to our program on the American system. We'll go through the whole history of Potemkin, Prince Potemkin, Catherine the Great, the road to Constantinople, how we got these Potemkin villages. It's a pure facade is the point here. So he's trying to get there and say, look, I'm not crazy. I can understand issues. I'm affable. I'm amiable. I can negotiate. I do negotiate. I'm not sectarian. I should be president. And, of course, it has, as a number of people pointed out, including the unspeakable Ann Coulter, the xenophobic passionaria, she says, look, Trump, you were trying to prove that you were capable of governing, and you proved the opposite. You proved that you have no real policies of your own. You showed that you simply parrot whatever the last person in the conversation said. You had to have Kevin McCarthy ride herd on you, and so forth, and that he's willing to do anything. Feinstein says, we want a freestanding, clean bill for DACA, and he says, yeah, that's fine. And then McCarthy has to say, wait a minute, don't let her sell you that bill of goods, because we've got to have the wall, or something like this. So that was on Tuesday. This then has led to other events. Yesterday, on Thursday morning, we had this shocking thing where the extension of the FISA Section 702, the ability to surveil foreign intelligence, foreign individuals, foreign soil, that was going to be approved. The administration had been mobilized for it. Right? It was that guy Short, the legislative affairs director. And in this case, then, Trump comes out and says, wait a minute, this looks like that same crazy thing that was used to wiretap my Trump Tower. And, of course, it turns out this had come from the nefarious Judge Napolitano on Fox News, on Fox and Friends, which seems to be the brain of Trump, right? If Trump became resentful to Bannon because he was touted as Trump's brain, well, why don't some enterprising people do a thing on Fox and Friends and how they dictate policies to the puppet Trump, and maybe you get him riled up enough on that. And then we had yesterday this gathering. This was the congressional delegation. It's a curious type of delegation. Now, this was to present to Trump the compromise on immigration and DACA, which they had presented. We're strongly in favor of DACA. This should go through. We want immigration to proceed in a rational and orderly fashion. So here it was, a rather numerous Republican delegation. Senator Lindsey Graham, Senator Tom Cotton, the infamous Cottonmouth. Now, this is a hardliner, right? This is a xenophobic extremist. He was there. Senator David Perdue of Georgia. Perdue, I guess he's part of the lost generation, or is it the lost souls of the GOP? Kevin McCarthy of California, the governor of Trump in that confab. Bob Goodlatte, retiring from Virginia. he had written the bill, apparently, and Representative Mario Diaz-Balart of Florida. So this entire troop of Republican plug uglies, joined by the redoubtable Dick Durbin of Illinois. So they go in there and start talking about things, and Durbin points out that there are certain forms of immigration from Africa and Haiti, and how these are preserved, at least to some extent, in the compromise bill. And then Trump went into a mental episode. Is it a psychotic episode? Well, we were waiting for the officials, the experts to comment, but it might be. And in that, he gets into this absolutely reprehensible tirade, scatological expletives, worse than Nixon. And apparently, according to one account, Lindsey Graham told him to shut up. Stop saying this stuff, Mr. President. Lindsey Graham has not confirmed that in public, but since he loves to go on the shows, that is probably just a matter of a couple of days. So what we're left with is it's now 1 week to the necessary refunding of the government. In other words, the current budget authority runs out 1 week from today, on Friday the 19th of January, as I understand it. And right now, this tantrum by Trump with the scatological expletives, this has made it much harder for anybody in the Democratic Party to deal with such an ogre. And there it is. So I would urge the Democrats, don't worry about shutting down the government necessarily, right? That might be salutary. But the main thing is to break break the Republican combine. And we'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., once again on the 12th of January. So, the New York Times editorial, is Trump nuts? Unfortunately, like so many of these other mainstream media, they won't give you a straight answer. And the New York Times says, well, we have to warn against violating the Goldwater Rule. The Goldwater Rule was essentially a bunch of academic mandarins asserting that somehow the narrow ethics of their individual field, and this is not the greatest field in many ways, but this is where they are, so that these people said, no, we can't have psychiatric opinions about public figures unless these figures have come forward and gotten analyzed by the individual psychologist, by the shrink, in other words, in question, and then they've got to give their permission for the data to be revealed. So it means you can't profile a public figure based on hundreds of hours of statements and a whole track record and dozens of books. No, you can't do that. Well, I'm afraid you have to do that, because otherwise you've left the door open for somebody, and it's been said before, you can have a candidate who's absolutely hallucinating, who's talking to voices in the wall, who's obsessed with visions and, hallucinations. Isn't it going to be necessary to say, wait a minute, this is not possible? This has to be ruled out? I think you do. Because remember, salus publica lex suprema. How about that one? The public health, it means more than health. It means public survival. The public survival is the supreme law. In other words, as Lincoln and others said, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. In other words, the punctilious observance of every point in the Constitution cannot be allowed to get in the way of saving the entire form of government, the entire state, and the entire society. So, yes, as the Romans had it, the public survival is the supreme principle of law. So, you don't want to have anybody stigmatized. You don't want to have abuses. But then you've got to keep madmen out of high public office, right? Don't we have enough examples in the 20th century of what happens if you let up on that? So, is Trump nuts? And in the course of this, as I recall it, they find a way to disparage Bandy Lee. Bandy Lee is doing yeoman service, and that book on the dangerous case of Donald Trump, that is a real contribution. It's a real public service. Hats off to these people, because they said, look, the Goldwater rule may or may not have validity, but there's also the duty to warn. In their profession, it comes up if you're psychoanalyzing somebody and they announce that they're going to go on a murder spree, then you have to break the confidentiality and go to the police and say, watch out for this guy. He is getting ready. He's fixing to go on a murder spree. So there it is. The responsibility to warn trumps the Goldwater rule. And after that big button, as well as the Fire and Fury, which is now enshrined as the title of Wolf's book, well, there is a duty to warn. Here's what I would say. You find all kinds of interesting articles here where people like the New York Times or the Washington Post, people who are making important contributions, or at least institutions that are making important contributions to the fight against totalitarianism, against authoritarian government, right, in favor of preserving our constitutional institutions. These people at various times lapse into the behavior that made them so resented during the aughties and into the current decade. In other words, the mentality of the gatekeeper, the mentality of the border guard, that they'll tell you which forms of argument are legitimate, which issues are taboo, which are not taboo, and therefore they'll tell you that Bandy Lee goes too far. Bandy Lee and her associates essentially say, we're not here to advocate any specific diagnosis. In other words, we're not going to pick up some, is it obsessive-compulsive disorder, is it narcissistic personality disorder, borderline disorder, whatever it is. No, that's not the issue. Simply to say, this is a clear and present danger. You've got to do something about the clear and present danger. So there's a sorting out process where you'd say to the New York Times, look, New York Times, your role in revealing lots and lots of valuable things to move the discussion, to educate public opinion, that's valuable. And there's where you should be commended, and that's where people want to read the paper, your paper. But don't start saying, oh, this is off limits, this is too much. No, we don't need gatekeepers. We don't need border guards of this type. So Bandy Lee's diagnosis is simply, this is dangerous. We got to do something. So that's one side of it. Now, the other thing here, this is another interesting point. In this context, we had a discussion between the neocon Max Boot on the one hand, and Tom Steyer is the, I think, civic-minded billionaire who is doing a lot, spending $30 million of his own money to make sure that the Democrats are competitive in the coming congressional election in November. It's getting very close. So this was, how would you describe the problem posed by Trump? So Boot puts it this way. He says, Trump has no policies. The only policy Trump has is self-aggrandizement. His only slogan is Trump über alles. That's all there is. It's completely random what he might embrace or not embrace. It's only himself, right? He's a self-promoter, and that's it. Now, there is a certain credibility to that, but then when you think about where that leads, you can see that this is inadequate. So Steyer, very much to his credit, I would say, said, look, there's something more, though. It's not just self-promotion. It's that he always comes down on the most extreme reactionary policy. The most extreme reactionary policy. And therefore, you've got to factor that in. Look at the health bill. 30, 40,000 dead Americans every year. Look at the budget. As Larry Summers tells us, 10,000 American deaths per year. Look at the opioid crisis. Doing nothing. 63,000 deaths. And it's not worth a state of emergency, a nationwide state of emergency. This is like 20 times 9/11. It's more than Vietnam. It's more than the Korean War. It's actually about, well, you can go through all the superlatives. So it's always the most reactionary policy. Now, you could say, well, that's because Trump is now the thrall of the reactionary Republicans. But wasn't that built in? Wasn't that always where he was headed, that he would merge with them and then take over a lot of their policies? And hold on to your hat, but you're going to see if Ryan gets the bit in his teeth, he's going to go forward with this, really monstrous attack on the social safety net, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. S-chip for children remains unfunded. Now, how many wellness visits, how many cases of preventive care and checkups have fallen by the wayside, and what are the consequences of that? How many need to die? So Steyer's argument carries today against Boot by a mile. Back in a minute. To the second hour now of World Crisis Radio here on the Martin Luther King weekend. Webster Tarpley here in the midst of the January thaw in the nation's capital. Now, we just want to continue this comparison here, this interesting exchange. Max Boot for the neocons and Tom Steyer for, I think, something much more promising. You notice that the attraction of the mental syndromes, in other words, the arguments based on mental disorder, dementia, things like this, are attractive to a certain kind of right-winger because it would allow them then to oppose Trump on the narrowest of bases, saying, well, we're not going to attack your tax cut, we're not going to attack your takedown of entitlements, we're not going to attack your foreign policy even, but we're simply going to say, you are temperamentally, psychologically unsuited to office. Whereas what Steyer is pointing to is that you've got to expose this administration up and down the line, that it's the policies on economics, on deregulation, on the healthcare debacle, on the failure to defend the general welfare against the opioid epidemic, the budget, and of course the blood-curdling war threats against little Kim over there in North Korea. That would then that leads you, I think, to a much broader attack. So there are a lot of people now who have rehabilitated themselves. Right, these are, in many cases, Republicans and neocons, and they do throw a certain weight into the fight, so that's fine. But don't ever forget that those Republican Party policies are the ones that led directly to Trump. The Republican wedge issues invented by Lee Atwater, practiced by Karl Rove and so many others, those are the ones that the Russians then used, right? The Russian Facebook propaganda is essentially based on classic Republican wedge issues: guns, God, gays, race, abortion, all the rest of it, right? The irritants, right? The hot-button social issues that can be used to divide the continuation into our time of the Franklin D. Roosevelt political coalition. So that's one thing. Now, here's the other thing I think we ought to say about this, having watched some of this coverage. Don Lemon yesterday on CNN, obviously tremendously offended, and we join with that. He starts his program saying Donald Trump is a racist. Well, of course, this is hardly news. Cable news network, that's not news. And then in the course of this broadcast, where Lemon clashes with various Trump acolytes, and that's fine. Why do you have them on there at all in the first place? He says, let's make it clear, there's no economic factor in the Trump coalition. Economics plays zero role. I think that is a really serious mistake. If you look at racism as a kind of independent factor, it's a kind of ideological virus that exists at certain times more, certain times less. You've got to see this anchored in institutions. It's got to be anchored in economics as well as things that are purely psychological and so forth. Let me take an extreme example. And this is especially if you want to break up the Trump coalition, promote the fragmentation and disintegration of the Trump coalition, you've got to have an economic program. There's just no way around it. The salient fact about the U.S. political system, which is so widely ignored, is that vast areas of the U.S. population have experienced a decline in living standard by 1/2 to 2/3 since 1967, 73, 74, different ways to do it. This is grasped in a crude way by these Trump people, although they only have demagogic solutions, right? Their solution is keep the immigrants out. That's ridiculous. The immigrants are not the cause. The cause is Wall Street domination. The main tormentor of blue-collar, Appalachian, Middle West, white workers, this is not the immigrants. It is Wall Street financiers of the type that Trump values so much, of the kind that dominate the Trump cabinet. In other words, blame it on Goldman Sachs, not on some worker trying to come in and earn a buck. So the decline in the standard of living has got to be addressed because this is the terrain, the humus in which it grows. And if you want to deal with this, we, of course, have the program here at the Tax Wall Street Party. 30 million jobs financed by the Federal Reserve with 0% 100-year bonds as needed. That's your infrastructure program, $5 trillion plus, and 10 million more jobs in the Conyers plan, the Marion Barry plan, which is WPA, PWA on budget, financed by, of course, a tax on precisely these Wall Street interests, a Wall Street sales tax. So nationalize the Fed for a job creation program. Don't borrow from China. You've got your own credit machine right here. Not just that the Federal Reserve serves the rotten zombie banks. It's got to serve the public interest, and then that Wall Street has to start paying taxes. And right now, thanks to this regime, Wall Street is paying less and less. Now, let's just do an extreme example. Let's look at European fascism, the two extreme forms, Mussolini and Hitler, and say, does an economic disturbance, are there economic factors in the rise of classical fascism? Of course, there are these economic factors. Look at Mussolini. He comes to power first in October 1922 with the March on Rome. What's the prelude to that? Well, the prelude is the worldwide economic depression of 1920 to 1921. It's the one that all kinds of reactionaries, libertarians, Friedmanites, they all write about this. They say that was the way to handle it. In other words, do nothing, cut the budget, and then you'll have a recovery. Well, of course, there was a recovery, but too bad this was then the way that fascism came to Italy. The crisis, the labor troubles, the occupation of the factories in 1919, 1920, combined with this crash of 20 to 21, that was long-lasting enough in Italy to set the stage for a fascist seizure of power. Now, how about Hitler? Well, the first big public action by the Nazis is November 1923. This is the beer hall putsch, but it's in particular the attempt to take over the center of Munich with the help of Ludendorff, who had been the dictator really of the entire country in the end of the war. So it's the hyperinflation of 1923, and then Hitler and his group go into action with Ludendorff just as that hyperinflation reaches its pinnacle. So very definite, tremendous economic dislocation. After that, they go into a kind of eclipse with the so-called relative stabilization of the German economy, 1924, with the Young Plan and various U.S. loans. But then they come back into their own when? In 1929, 1930-31, with the world economic crisis triggered by the Wall Street panic and by the Bank of England going off the gold standard in September of 1931. So you can't begin to talk about the causes of fascism unless you're willing to factor in these overwhelmingly factors. And we have more about this in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Back to World Crisis Radio, Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So again, the rise of fascism is simply incomprehensible without factoring in these huge economic dislocations, the crash of 20 to 21, the German hyperinflation of 23, and then finally the disintegration of the entire world economy, Wall Street panic of October 1929, British default on gold payment in September 1931. And the guy who sums all this up, I think, is this Anton Erkelenz, Erkelenz. And he says, look, if you want to fight Hitler fascism, you can't use arguments. I mean, you can use arguments. You have to use arguments, but this will not be decisive. What's going to be decisive is to produce an economic recovery, to essentially, your main argument is job creation. Not arguments, but jobs. And we have it, right? 30 to 40 million new jobs, socially necessary and or productive. And that's how you do it. You want to cut them off at the knees, that's the way you do it. Not with long tirades about how you're a racist and you're a racist. Yeah, of course. There's racism all over the place. But then, see, what are you going to do about it? That's what the one thing I wanted to ask Don Lemon. You say, oh, Trump is a racist. Okay, what are you going to do about it? And there would have to be, the most minimal thing would be to say, Trump has to be removed from office. They don't ever get to that point, you notice? And then beyond that, if we say that the Trump movement reflects deep problems in U.S. society, well, I think that's the 40-year rule of reactionary financiers, right? Wall Street domination with the help of the Republicans from Nixon through George W. Bush and his TARP bailout and all that. Well, then, what are you going to do about it? We say, you want to essentially get this guy out of power and then use the momentary advantage to enact a sweeping program of job creation. What Obama never had, what Hillary never had, or maybe had it but never mentioned it. She kept it well hidden. Now, right now, we've got Schumer and the better deal says 10 million jobs. I've heard Bernie Sanders say 15 million jobs. They're beginning to get it. But the question with the jobs is, who's paying for the jobs? Is it going to be a regressive tax on wage earners? No. It's got to be a tax on Wall Street, starting with their turnover, which is the one thing they cannot hide. There's just no way. There's no team of lawyers that can hide transactions going across an exchange. And then, of course, the Federal Reserve, right? Make the Federal Reserve cough up the money to finance a recovery, job creation, credit creation for job creation. So again, Erke Lentz is correct. The way to stop Hitler would have been build the Autobahn, 2 to 3 million jobs, let's say, in 1931 to 1932. That would have drained a large part of the pool of unemployed and despairing and essentially cut the Nazis off at the knees. That makes sense. And those arguments were put forward. W.S. Voitinsky, later a U.S. economist, you can look him up, 20th Century Fund, he proposed that, the Voitinsky-Tarnow-Bada plan for a credit, a loan credit system like we're talking about, credit stimulus from the central bank, the Reichsbank, to go and start building these things, right? Also telephones, railroads, things like this. And, of course, Wilhelm Lautenbach on the right-wing side from the finance ministry, very, very similar program. And, again, if that had been implemented in 1931 to 1932, you would not have had, most likely, a seizure of power by fascists. Now, von Schleicher, the last gasp of the Weimar Republic, was able to pass some of this stuff, and it meant that, unfortunately, by the time Hitler came into power, there was already a significant reduction of unemployment that was already going on, which he claimed credit for. Now, is this relevant? Well, I'm afraid it is. Look at Charlottesville. Go back to Charlottesville. You had neo-Nazis, okay? Neo-Nazis, that means Nazis, kind of Nazis. That's who some of these people were, a lot of them. And they were chanting, you all saw it, blood and soil, blood and soil. Now, that is a Nazi slogan. And it is not just any Nazi, but it's the Hitler faction. Specifically, there would have been other groups, right? There would have been the urban industrial Strasser faction, right? The not so peasant oriented, right? People who didn't like this peasant orientation. That would have been different. So what they've gone is directly to the absolute worst that you can find in recent history, the Hitler faction of the Nazi Party. And they say blood and soil. So that's what you're dealing with. Now, in the face of that, when you've got people chanting blood and soil, is it really enough to say racism? I think there's some people today, much under the influence of the identity group epistemology, who think somehow racism is the worst thing you can be. I'm afraid it's not the worst. There's something worse, and something worse starts with fascism. Now let's talk about this. The Ku Klux Klan. This is an interesting insight from an American writer by the name of William Paxton. He has pointed to the fact that the original Ku Klux Klan of Nathan Bedford Forrest and the rest of these Confederates in the 1870s and so forth, that this was the first fascist movement in the Atlantic world, the clearest example, and I think that makes a great deal of sense. But let's just try to, using the very limited time we have, how about just 10 points on what it means to be a fascist? Well, to be a fascist, first of all, means absolutely racism. It includes that. That's very salient, right? Who had race theory? Who had the greatest racist genocide in world history, or at least in many ways? This was the Nazi race theory, and the Ku Klux Klan. Look at that as a precursor, because that's the Paxton argument. And this is a scholar, right? This is not some columnist. So it's got racism at the center, but there's more. And the idea that certain groups are inferior, right? Certain groups are Untermenschen, subhuman, is the argument from people. Well, that's number one. But there's so much more, and we'll be back in a minute. The argument is to do justice to certain phenomena that are unfolding around us. Fascism would be an adequate term, whereas to limit this simply to racism actually does not capture the full horror of what you're dealing with. So, fascism emphatically contains racism, race theory, to the point of genocide, as we saw, the idea that certain ethnic groups are inferior. This seems to be what's often operating. Then, however, there's more. You've got to be it's got to have a militarist dimension, right? The idea of aggressive war, blood-curdling threats. Haven't we been hearing them? It's got to be an international conspiracy, really, to wage aggressive war. So that would be a second characteristic. Then we got austerity, killer austerity, genocidal austerity, what you can call technically Schachtian austerity. This is Hjalmar Schacht, finance minister for Hitler, otherwise the designer of a lot of the Nazi economic policies. And of course, what we've seen is the wrecking of a health plan, right? Determined, deliberate attempt to wreck a health system where it's clear and has been published that tens of thousands of needless deaths will result. The budget, once again, 10,000 needless deaths, and then a coming attack on entitlements. That's fascist-style austerity. Now, racism alone does not include this austerity as a term. And then, of course, you've got to have a mass movement of some kind, right? Anybody who argued that Mrs. Clinton is a fascist, well, the problem with that is she can't fill a phone booth with her supporters, right? It's got to be a mass movement of some kind, in some form. And very often, it's a violent one. That's in order to fulfill the full bill here. It's got to be violent. In other words, it's got to be gangs. It's got to be armed militia. Have we seen any of those? I'm afraid we have. Is it the German Freikorps, right? The groups of armed, disgruntled veterans who have been engaging in various things along the border. Okay? Have we seen armed veterans showing up at the border? I'm afraid we have, at least on one border. The squadre, right, the teams that the Italian fascists set up. This is the idea. Another one, it's got to be anti-parliamentarian. Isn't this an important factor to say, essentially, that all the people in the Congress are idiots, to have fights with them, all parties, you're all bankrupt, right? Just let me do it. And that, of course, goes together with the idea that established constitutional rights have to be eroded, right? Big attack on the First Amendment and related things. Big attack on unions, right? They have to be busted. A number of fascist movements actually start as strike-breaking movements in order to deal with either strikes by farmers, peasants, or by industrial workers, right? That's the Italian 1919 to 1920 example. There's also then the notion of a second revolution. In other words, taking power in political terms is what they usually write about. But then later on, they say, well, we want to take over the main institutions. We want to become the heads of the main corporations. We want to take over the military and so forth, right? So after you seize power initially as a fascist, then you want to extend that through public and private institutions. Then misogyny. We've always stressed this, right? You can see books that I've written about this, that quite a number of people point to the horror of women as one of the salient, sometimes one of the most visible, very visible at least, characteristics of fascist movements, right? That these are veterans, we've got to be tough, we can't be soft, we can't be feminine, we don't want any of that, and we're essentially brutes, right? We're all cads, and therefore we can we can mistreat women and abuse them in any way. And you could see this. This was something visible here in the U.S. in the middle of the teens now, right? Pre-current regime, that there was this current of the hatred of women among these alt-right characters, right? A lot of their mythology revolves around this. So in addition to that, we'd have to say irrationalism plays a huge role. You can't have a movement like this. You can't have a movement that goes from Goldman Sachs to a self-deluded populist in the Midwest living in a devastated community, right? That you can't imagine a commonality of interest unless you've essentially screwed up your own mind with wild irrationalism. And I guess going together with that, this constant refrain, mythology. Let's make the nation great again. Let's live up to our ideals, right, of supremacy or exceptionalism or whatever it is, and let's therefore we'll go back to the utopian halcyon state that you never really had, but that you think you had, and therefore you're chasing it back into the past. I would also stress the denial of reality. This is one of the deepest characteristics of fascism, and it was the idea that you don't want to hear bad news. We on a recent program, we did how Hitler's defeat in the Battle of Stalingrad really could have been avoided, at least the worst part of it could have been avoided, if he'd simply taken the advice to withdraw, right? But he had this idea that the generals were hopeless, right, that they were cowardly, that they were disloyal, and therefore he had to insist, and so forth. And that's how von Paulus and his 200,000 men were caught in this pocket, right? And then the whole army was wiped out. Part of this is the denial of reality. It has roots in Nietzsche, although most of these people have never read Nietzsche or maybe never heard of him. The idea of the world as will and imagination is simply that the fundamental reality, as I think even Nietzsche writes, he says, the fundamental reality is your drives, your impulses, and your desire to impose your drives and your impulses on the world. That's the world as will and imagination. And of course, what will are they talking about? You're talking about the will to power. The will to power, to exercise the will to power, to take power and impose that on others and crush them and humiliate them as needed. So that's a good list of, 10, 12 different aspects that are included. So when you say fascism, you say a mouthful. And notice, this is not directed by any stretch of the imagination against any group in the current U.S. population. Is there anybody who has signed up for this? I mean, there are some, right? There's a limited lunatic fringe, the blood and soil marchers of Charlottesville. But notice also, some of these commentators say, why, look at those guys in Charlottesville. They're not hurting economically. Those guys are all buttoned down, khaki pants, loafers. They've got, if they don't have Brooks Brothers, they've got Joseph A. Banks. That's not the point. Naturally, the wealthy sons of privilege gravitate towards these movements. But you got to ask yourself, where did the movement get going? Where did it get any momentum in the first place? Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., and we've reached the last segment of our Martin Luther King weekend program, and we're trying to offer ways to observe and also update the Martin Luther King vision. Now, this amounts to what we're talking about now is how to go beyond, how to subsume what is valid in the identity group outlook, because many elements are valid. Many of them are indispensable. But they are not going to be enough to have a successful countering of the current regime and send it to its richly deserved place in oblivion in November. So the identity group method simply will not work, especially if you go around yelling white racism, then there are quite a few people who are going to feel threatened by that, and they don't need to be that. Whereas if your chant is down with fascism, let's not have this horrible array of things that we've just said in the previous segments, then that is much easier to embrace. So why not learn the lesson, right? Don't call it single payer, call it Medicare for all. Don't call it the death tax, call it the oligarch tax, and so forth, right? In other words, the language really does matter. Now, we said that the identity group outlook was actually inculcated by ruling class counterinsurgency operatives back in the days of Nixon and Schultz, and even before that, or more or less on the transition between the LBJ administration and the Nixon-Schultz administration. We also had this other episode, which I think is important, the Kerner Commission. Otto Kerner, governor of Illinois, after the riots, after Newark and Detroit, and of course Watts a couple of years earlier, they did a question, well, what is the issue here, right? What is causing these disturbances? And in line with ruling class ideology, right, financier ideology, they said, well, it's white racism. It's that the average white worker is a racist. And those white racist attitudes are the things that we've got to fight and address. Now, again, how do you do that? Well, what they did essentially perpetuated them. Whereas you really have to say the oppression, the despair, the energy that was expressed in these riots, in order to treat it, you'd have to have a very expensive program of national reconstruction. You'd have to be building urban mass transit, building modern, attractive housing. You've got to be providing health care to ghetto victims, in effect, right, to the oppressed communities in the inner cities. You'd have to be providing jobs above all, right? You'd have to have a pretty comprehensive jobs program. So between health, education, mass transit, jobs, and so forth, you see this gets into the area of what we're talking about, right? We say $6 to $7 trillion for education and infrastructure. That's about what it would have taken, and of course, adjusting for the times and the currencies. And that's what the ruling class didn't want. The ruling class then and now don't want to be taxed for this. That's why the condition proceeds. So we would say this is one of the roots of a mistaken attitude which still goes on. Now, the other thing that's going on, which we need to keep track of always, is Mueller. And that Mueller essentially is the factor that allows us to develop a certain kind of optimism about this. It's clear that whatever Trump says, the interview between Trump and the Mueller team is coming fairly soon. It's going to be in the next month or 2 months or whatever it is, but that it's going to happen. And that Trump's assurances that he's not going to be investigated, this is simply baloney. Notice Congressman Schiff is warning us that Nunes, the Republican reactionary, right? This is the guy who went on the midnight ride down to the White House to do a publicity stunt and try to blunt the Comey testimony of a couple of days before. Nunes is attempting to sabotage the House Intelligence Committee. Schiff and others say it's time to interview once again Javanka, the two of them, on the question of the June 2016 collusion meeting, right? The Vieselnitskaya appearance there in Trump Tower, but that Nunes and others are trying to block that avenue of investigation. Hats off to Senator Feinstein this week. Guy, go and read this thing, right? This is the testimony of Glenn Simpson, the head of Fusion GPS, who delivered his version of how it started. Now, we got to add something to this. The Russiagate probe, right, the FBI's Russiagate investigation did not start with this dossier, right? The 35-page Compromat dossier was not the starting point. And we've learned a little bit more about this now, but we can be very, very emphatic that that's not where it starts. Dispensing with the details, the British government, GCHQ, right, Cheltenham, their equivalent of Fort Meade, and linked by an umbilical cord to Fort Meade, they became aware of nefarious contacts between the Trump machine and the Russian establishment, in a broad sense, quite early on. And, that's the British. We've had the other case, Papadopoulos. He was aware of it because he spilled the beans to this Australian diplomat, the Australian ambassador to Britain, an important guy, clearly, got that word, and then later on he spread it. But I would also like to point out, go to Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. Here's where you find an article from the London Guardian. This is an article from mid-April of last year, getting to be a year ago. British spies were the first to spot Trump team's links to Russia. This is well before any FBI investigation, and it's well before the Compromat dossier. And instead, what you have is a list of countries who had urgently reported to the United States, hey, watch out, the Trump campaign is essentially colluding with Russia in ways that we cannot really explain. And this is, you got to scroll down the page a little bit, but going back to when, 2 weeks ago maybe, just go down the page on Webster G. Tarpley. What were the other countries? Well, the British were number one. The Australians, I think, came later, and probably in between, although we don't have all the stuff on this. Who is in between? Germany, Berlin, that's one. Poland is two. Going further east, Estonia is another one. And then we get the Netherlands and France. So France, Germany, Poland, Estonia. Those are some pretty big European countries reporting. And I think it's that outage, those reports that triggered the formal collusion probe by the FBI in mid-2016, which then Comey reported about in spring, March of 2017, and now we're in 2018. So we wish everybody a happy Martin Luther King Day. Spend some time pondering the stuff we're trying to tell you. His method was the uniting of all these disparate groups. It was not identity politics, not quotas for any specific group, but for broad-based prosperity in which all would participate. Therefore, he was a nationalist, and that's real nationalism. Back this week.